Rome in the early 4th century was supposed to be running on a clever management system called the Tetrarchy. 4 emperors neatly arranged, responsibilities shared, succession planned, no surprises. It was, in theory, the imperial equivalent of a well-designed spreadsheet. In practice, it became a knife fight with paperwork. Retirements happened, promotions happened, people died, and suddenly everyone with a military coat and a claim to legitimacy was applying for the top job with armed references. Out of this cheerful administrative chaos emerged 2 men on a collision course, Constantine and Maxentius. Constantine had been proclaimed by his troops in 306 after the death of his father, Constantius, in York. Yes, York, because Rome's destiny often takes weird scenic routes. Maxentius, meanwhile, secured power in Rome itself, backed by local elites in the Praetorian Guard, that famously temperamental king-making institution that treated emperors like limited-time offers. Both men could claim they were lawful rulers, both had armies, both had propaganda, both were certain destiny had booked their side of the battlefield. By 312, diplomacy had done what Roman diplomacy usually did in civil wars, postponed the stabbing. Constantine moved first and moved fast. He drove into northern Italy and won a string of victories, including major successes near Turin and Verona. Every win did 2 things at once. It weakened Maxentius militarily and strengthened Constantine psychologically because Roman politics rewarded momentum like a blood sport. Cities watched carefully and made practical decisions about loyalty. Nobody wants to back the emperor whose statues are about to be melted down. Maxentius had a workable defensive option, stay behind Rome's walls and force a long, ugly siege, but pressure mounted. Rumors spread, nerves tightened. Symbolism started replacing strategy, which is usually a bad sign in any era, but especially in one where defeat includes beheading. Then came October 28, 312 CE, near the Milvian Bridge on the Tiber. Maxentius marched out to meet Constantine in open battle, reportedly on the anniversary of his accession, perhaps trusting omen over logistics. Rome had seen this before, leaders who confuse auspicious date with sound tactical plan. The stage was set. One side had momentum, the other had the capital and a brittle fallback plan involving a temporary bridge. History, as usual, prepared to reward whoever made fewer catastrophic decisions per minute. Before the fighting, the story turns toward the most famous and contested episode of Constantine's career, the Vision. Ancient sources disagree in details, and they do not disagree quietly. One tradition says Constantine received a dream instructing him to place a sacred sign linked to Christ on his soldiers' shields. Another account adds a dramatic sign in the sky and the promise of victory through that sign. Historians still debate what happened, when it happened, and how later memory polished it for political and theological effect. But whatever the exact sequence, Constantine clearly fused military ambition with a new kind of divine messaging, and that combination would outlive every soldier on the field. This matters because Roman power was never just about winning battles. It was about explaining wins in a way that made your rule feel inevitable. If you could claim heaven had picked you, you weren't merely victorious, you were authorized. Constantine understood that language. He approached Rome along the Via Flaminia, the strategic artery to the city, while Maxentius arranged his forces near the Tiber, with a standard bridge and a temporary pontoon crossing as fallback. On paper, that looks prudent. In retreat conditions, it looks like an invitation to mass panic. Imagine the geometry: tens of thousands of men, tight formations, cavalry pressure, dust, shouting, collapsing command signals, and behind one army a river crossing that absolutely must function under maximum stress. That is not a backup plan. That is an engineering exam taken during a house fire. Constantine's forces pressed hard. Maxentius's line began to buckle. Once units started pulling back unevenly, discipline dissolved into survival instincts, and survival instincts do not cue politely for pontoon traffic control. The battle at Milvian Bridge was less a cinematic duel of two commanders and more a cascading systems failure in real time. One army kept advancing with confidence, the other compressed toward a narrow escape route and paid the full price of bottleneck physics. In civil wars, men often die for causes. At Milvian Bridge, many died because there was no room to run. The Tiber became the final arbiter, uninterested in titles, legal claims, or very sincere speeches about rightful succession. As Constantine's attack drove Maxentius's army backward, the retreat toward the river turned catastrophic. Accounts differ on the precise mechanics, but the outcome is consistent. The temporary bridge failed amid the crush. Soldiers fell or were forced into the water, and the retreat became a rout. Maxentius himself, armored and swept into the chaos, drowned in the Tiber. In one afternoon, a ruler of Rome disappeared beneath the same river that had witnessed centuries of imperial ceremony. Rome could be theatrical, but it did not do gentle endings for defeated usurpers. The immediate aftermath was brutally Roman in its clarity. Constantine entered Rome as victor. Maxentius's body was recovered. His head was displayed to confirm the transfer of power beyond reasonable doubt. Messages were sent to provinces still loyal to the fallen regime, because in a fragmented empire, certainty travels faster when attached to undeniable evidence. One day earlier, allegiance was negotiable. One day later, reality had updated. Senators adapted. Officials adapted. Armies adapted. Survival has always been Rome's most consistent ideology. What made Milvian Bridge more than just another civil war win was the symbolism Constantine chose afterward. He did not present the victory as random luck or purely human skill. He framed it as divinely sanctioned and increasingly in connection with the Christian God. This did not mean the empire transformed overnight into a fully Christian state with instant doctrinal unity and matching hymn books. It meant the emperor's public center of gravity had shifted and imperial favor was beginning to move in a new direction. And when imperial favor moves, institutions move with it. The old religious order did not vanish immediately, but it had lost exclusivity at the top. Christian communities that had recently faced persecution now found themselves dealing with an emperor who could protect them, fund them, and eventually interfere with them in classic Roman administrative style. Constantine did not step out of history as a modern religious reformer. He stepped into it as a Roman ruler who had discovered that military victory, legal authority, and theological narrative could be welded into one durable system. Milvian Bridge was the forge. The year after the battle, Constantine and Licinius issued arrangements commonly associated with the Edict of Milan, granting broad toleration and restoring confiscated Christian property. That sounds technical, but the consequences were enormous. Christians moved from periodic target status toward legal security. Bishops moved from crisis management to institution building. The state did not simply stop persecuting, it began recognizing. In empire terms, that is a constitutional earthquake delivered as administrative prose. Milvian Bridge also reshaped hard power inside the regime. The Praetorian Guard, long notorious for political meddling and emperor shopping, was dismantled by Constantine. This was reform dressed as revenge, and revenge dressed as reform. Punish Maxentius's support base while removing a chronic source of instability. Rome had spent generations watching elite guards influence succession with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. Constantine preferred a military structure that owed everything to him and less to old capital networks. Then came memory, carved in stone. The Arch of Constantine commemorated his victory and credited it to divine inspiration in language broad enough to satisfy multiple audiences. It was a masterclass in imperial messaging, specific enough to sound meaningful, flexible enough to avoid immediate revolt from those not yet ready for a fully Christian political vocabulary. Constantine governed a mixed empire and understood that abrupt ideological purity is a luxury emperors rarely survive. So he did what effective rulers do. He changed direction without pretending everyone had already arrived. That is why Milvian Bridge still matters. It was not only a military turning point, it was a narrative turning point. A civil war battle outside Rome became the launch point for a new imperial identity, a new relationship between throne and church, and a new map of legitimacy in the Roman world. Maxentius lost a battle and a life. Constantine won a battle and then won the story about why it was won. And in history, winning the story is often the part that lasts longest. So if you want the sharp summary, at Milvian Bridge, bad retreat planning met relentless pressure, a rival emperor drowned, and the Roman future changed course. Swords decided the afternoon, symbolism decided the centuries.